All right, we are live again, and this is Beyond the Big Screen live event on Wednesdays. We are joined by Chris from Canada again. I'm thinking maybe we should call this Beyond the Big Screen Night in Canada, and we're in Chris's corner right now, but you got to be dressed a little bit more fancy than you are right now to really pull
Yeah,
that off. So how you doing, Chris?
doing good. Been busy at work, but I've been, looking forward to this episode for a little while now when we started discussing about like just the Mafia series. Roy Demeo is kind of a guy that I've always found pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I think before we even really get into it, he is one of the more interesting characters I think we've bumped up across, and I think he's going to become even more interesting. But let's get right into it. Now, today
This meeting is being recorded.
we're back on Beyond the Big Screen, and I'm excited again to be joined by Chris to talk about the background of a really infamous and, in a sick way, intriguing mafia figure, Roy Demeo. Chris and I are jumping into a really the deep end of the mafia pool here, and we're really glad you joined us today. This episode and the previous episode on Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, is going to build a lot of background that we'll use to talk about the 2012 movie Iceman. So let's really get into it. And I think Roy DeMeo is maybe not a he's probably not one of the names that really comes up as one of people's first like most known mafia figures, especially compared to his contemporary of somebody like John Gotti. But he was really extremely influential in his time, and maybe one of the most intriguing mafia characters of all time. What do you think, just like your first brush and your first blush, I guess you might say, of Roy DeMeo?
Yeah, it's like you pointed out, Roy Demeo isn't as particularly well known as some of these other mafia guys. I think one of the reasons is where Hollywood and popular culture tries to present the mafia as kind of glitz and glamorous to a degree, where it almost seems like kind of like a fun thing. Where like when you start reading about Roy DeMeo, it's the exact opposite of that. It's the kind of really what the mob is, boiled down to its essence. And Roy kind of perfectly represents that, where it's not glitz and glamour. It's rough, it's dirty, it's kind of vile and disgusting.
It's a horror story, really. I mean, if you took away and said that this wasn't real and you just told somebody about I mean, not to give away too much, but a place where people go in, they get murdered and dismembered and just disappear. It's literally a scene from a horror movie, DeMeo's life.
Yeah, and it really does come across. Yeah, his entire life is. It's like a kind of like what you would think would be like almost like a cheesy B kind of horror film where, this guy is he's one thing to a certain group of people, but then like when he's away from those people, he's an upstanding citizen. It really but this is real. It's 100% real.
I doing a little bit of ancestry.com, I knew from my family that there was DeMeos. That's sort of the overarching family that my family belongs to. Is my great grandmother was her maiden name was DeMeo, and I tried so desperately to see if I was some connection to Roy. I didn't find it, but it's not that uncommon. It's not that common of a name. I'm gonna keep finding out. Maybe we'll do an update at some point and see if there's in some weird way I'm distantly related to Roy DeMeo. But the best way to start out trying to dig into Roy DeMeo and try and learn something about him is his kind of messed up childhood. Tell us about Roy Demeo's really screwed up childhood.
Yeah, it wasn't as bad. It wasn't like don't get it wasn't anything like Richard's, but it's yeah, it's a pretty weird childhood. Like Roy was I mean, he would struggle with weight issues his entire life, but growing up he was picked on for being overweight but from the other kids, and his brother was kind of looked upon as the golden child. He was going to become the doctor, and the family kind of devoted their attention to him. And Roy really looked up to him too. And pretty early on, he went to go serve in Vietnam. I believe he volunteered. He wasn't drafted or anything, and he was killed in Vietnam. And Roy had a really hard time dealing with this because he didn't really have his older brother there to protect him from the bullies. So he learned to protect himself. He started weightlifting and took up boxing and became known as pretty ruthless street fighter. But then, shortly after his brother passes away, his father dies unexpectedly too. And this is a really weird thing. His mother came up with this idea that she was gonna go back to Italy, to be around friends and family, and kind of left Roy by himself in his, what was he, in his early 20s at the time? Not even, right?
Yeah,
Late teens.
that whole thing with Roy's childhood. He's the DeMeos, and they kind of spell this out, and it's hard to psychoanalyze somebody who's been dead for 40 years, and things that happened 60 years ago. But his family was successful. His one uncle was a high-ranking prosecutor in Brooklyn. Another was the head medical examiner of New York City, or some part of New York City government. So doctors, lawyers. Roy's father was working class, and they lived in a pretty rough and tumble, rough part of Brooklyn, but a lot of successful people came out of there. So you can't necessarily just say that Roy came from a rough family like Richard Kuklinski, like you had mentioned, but you also can't say that it wasn't all just his background. There's something in Roy, I think, that he was mean, and all these things, like his brother getting killed in Vietnam, and the mafia thing that was kind of floating around this rough part of Brooklyn that he lived in. It all kind of got boiled down in him, and just brought out the very worst in Roy, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, he had to learn to take care of himself at a pretty young age. And, in comparison to Richard, yeah, this seems like a cakewalk. But I mean, that's pretty tragic. His brother dying in Vietnam, and then his father passing away when he was still young, and then his mom leaving for Italy. And I mean, that to me, I just can't understand the logic in her head. But I mean, maybe she talked to Roy and Roy told her, just go. But it seems like a really weird choice to make. And yeah, and I believe he ends up becoming like a butcher's apprentice and a delivery driver, and he does really good at that. And he actually becomes like the best like meat delivery guy, and he ends up earning extra money and learning quickly that he can use this extra money to do some, low tier loan sharking.
Did you maybe, when I read that Roy DeMeo's mom brought, I think it was his younger brother, to Italy to go
Yeah.
live, did you think that maybe there was just some kernel that she was trying to get the younger brother away from Roy?
It's very possible. I mean, their mothers know their sons probably better than anybody, right? And maybe she saw the direction that Roy was going in and didn't want her youngest son to fall in that type of crowd. It's very possible.
that's another one, the what ifs, but what if Roy's brother had come back from Vietnam as a hero, and Roy, I think that could have been something where Roy goes and joins the Marines too and goes to Vietnam, and then we don't have Roy DeMeo. Like, I honestly think that it could have been that Roy became so embittered with everything that at that just really critical time in his development, he sees his brother do something that a lot of people, like, I think the father wasn't so much into the brother joining the Marines, but it really did like open up all this anger that Roy had. It clamped down inside of him. It just gave him an escape valve to just say, you know what, screw everything.
Yeah, for sure. Especially at a young age, that type of tragedy, losing a young brother can trigger those types of emotions. And some people, I mean, it's fairly common for that to come out of people. Most people are able to like rein it back in over time, which they go through like the grieving process. Where obviously with Roy, that just never happened.
Then I think one other element to the whole story is that the mafia was really never that far away from where they were living. I mean, they were living in an area that there was mobsters all over the place. And was it Roy's mom who wound up going to live with Joe Profaci's, the one of the biggest mafia guys of all time's widowed wife?
Yeah, and it wasn't like this might get me in a little bit of trouble, but like many Italian Americans at that time that we're talking about, kind of they viewed the mob where those are our bad guys. You know what I mean? Where it was just something that people grew around with and they grew up around with and they just kind of accepted it. It's like every group has their, quote unquote bad guys, and the mob just happens to be our bad guys. And it's kind of it's a I use a comparison. It's kind of like the Hell's Angels a little bit up here in Canada, where especially in like the Quebec area, where it's just something that's just it's not as bad as it used to be, but it used to be like really like all over the place, and it was just everybody kind of knew somebody who was kind of part of the Hells Angels, even if they were just on, the very edges of it, or they knew somebody that knew somebody. And I mean, this is kind of how the mob was, and especially in like areas like Brooklyn at the time, where I mean, everyone just kind of, especially if you were Italian, you probably knew somebody who was, somewhat related to the mob to one degree or another. And it was you also didn't really trust the federal government and state authorities at the time too, so you didn't really talk to them about it either, and everybody knew kind of what happened to people that talked too. I know, does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think especially somebody like Roy, who had this legitimate part of his family who were at the highest levels of government. But like you said, nobody in Brooklyn in the 1950s or the 1960s was that far away from some connection to the mafia. Even as
Yeah.
straight as people wanted to be, that it was still, you were in school. I think I can't remember who was the mobsters that lived just down the street from Roy DeMeo, and he would hang out with them. It might have been the Profaci kids. And I think both of those
Yeah.
Profaci kids wound up becoming doctors or lawyers or something legit. But it was never that far away from being from some connection to the mafia. Now, Roy clearly doesn't go into the legitimate direction. He fully embraces the mafia. What's kind of his early career in crime?
Well, it's like I pointed out, he was a apprentice butcher, and he was very good at that. And he was like a delivery boy, and he would, would do more deliveries than everybody else. And he, with the extra cash that he earned from doing this, he would loan money out to, early loan sharking at exorbitant interests. And then quickly he got into auto car theft, basically, stealing car parts, stealing cars, chop shops, and he was doing this under the Lucchese family, which is one of the five families, but who were actually more known for this is the kind of weird part about this story. Like the Lucchese family were kind of known more for like these blue collar kind of crimes or the like auto theft and what have you. But somebody in the Gambino family, named Nino Gaggi, sees Roy Demeo and sees, this guy's really good at what he does. He's really effective and he's a good earner, and says, well, come with me, come join the Gambino family. You'll make even more money. And this is kind of how his criminal career starts.
Yeah, Roy starts off, and like you said, there was the five families, and we've talked about the five families a little bit, but at this point, not all families are equal, and the Lucchese's are kind of a low end mafia doing these things that are kind of low end crimes. And then Nino Gaggi comes in, and I think that Nino really saw the potential in Roy Demeo, that Roy Demeo could make a lot of money.
Yeah. And he makes a ton of money doing this. And this is also the time period where he starts setting up the early part of like the Demeo Crew. And this is where he meets Chris Rosenberg, who is a pretty fascinating character. He's this Jewish guy that grew up in an Italian neighborhood and hated the fact that he was Jewish, and basically thought of himself as Italian. I mean, he was Italian in anything but, I guess genetics or race or however you want to view it. And he had this dream that he was going to be the first Jewish guy that was going to be made in the Italian family. And it's pretty ambitious. I mean, they didn't even make Meyer Lansky. So I mean, he's a funny guy, not really, because we'll get into it later. He's completely ruthless, but Roy takes him under his wing and kind of views him as his kind of little brother, or kind of like a son, sort of. And Roy would loan out. Chris was also big into drug dealing, and Roy would loan him out money so he can buy more amounts of drugs, and Roy would make money, and Chris would make money, and Joseph and Patrick Testa and Anthony Center, and there were a couple other guys, but those are the three. Those are like the main guys in the Demeo crew. And yeah, he goes from there. And I mean, somehow during this time period too, somehow Roy wounds up being like a part of the board of directors of a credit union that he uses to launder money, and from his car theft operations, but also like the drug dealing operations that he has going on with Chris Rosenberg.
I don't think it's too far to say that Roy was really a criminal genius. He really understood how to make money with all these different things that he did. I mean, it's crazy all the different ways that he was earning money. One thing though is that at this point in the mafia in the 70s, early 70s, they say opening up the books is that they weren't making a lot of new mafia members at the time. So there was a lot of people like Roy DeMeo who were not strictly by definition in the mafia. They were attached to people like Nino Gaggi, who was a made man, but they weren't.
Yeah.
A lot of new people weren't being made at that time. So you had people like Roy DeMeo making fabulous amounts of money, but they weren't directly a part of the mafia, which gave them a lot of latitude to do things like drugs and working with Jews and Irish and all these different other gangs in a way that if they were fully made members of the mafia, they wouldn't be allowed to do.
Yeah, and it would in the book Murder Machine, they get into this where like Nino even is trying to when we get to it, we'll get to when we get to that part, but like Nino is trying to would tell Roy sometimes, you're probably better off not being made, because if the guys at the top of the family found out some of the stuff that you were up to, it would, cause a lot of problems for yourself. But that we'll get into that a little bit later into the podcast.
Well, why don't we talk about a little bit right now about Nino Gaji, because he is a really interesting character in this whole thing.
Yeah, so yeah, Nino's been he's sorry, he's a made guy in the Gambino crime family, and he grew up around the mob, right? And this has basically been his entire life, and he ends up becoming a capo, which is the boss of like a crew kind of, and how it works in the mafia after Gambino dies and Paul Castellano takes over. And he's like a weird guy because he's old school, but he's not really old school. And I don't know, how would you describe him?
He's I think that really is. He's the old school in a lot of ways, but he's also I think he's very American in a lot of ways too.
Yeah. I mean, and there's this great story. I don't know if you want to consider it great or not, but like he got into an argument with, I believe it was a boxer. I'm trying to remember this guy's name right now. They got into
Oh,
a fist fight, and I
Gennaro was
believe
his last name.
yeah, Gennaro, and he like broke his nose or roughed him up a little bit, and Nino Gaggi just swore revenge, and it took about 12 years until he got his revenge after repeated attempts of trying to get his revenge on this guy. This is just the type of person like Nino was, as an example. Like the story, it shouldn't be funny, but it is kind of funny. It seems like something that you would, that would come out of a comedy, kind of.
Nino just seemed to a guy like he wanted to think he was Vito Corleone from The Godfather. I
Yeah.
mean, he even talked about a lot about that, but he was really a small time hood in a lot of in most every way. He made a lot of money, but he wasn't very well thought out with it or anything like that. And he wasn't hitting guys all the time, or and he screwed up a lot of things. He's the a low to me a low rent mobster, and I'm glad he's not alive to hear me say that, but he's just not very impressive.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I mean, he definitely knew he's very like I would as much he might not probably wouldn't like this, but he's very much a street guy, right? And doing like low end crimes and stuff that's not particularly glamorous. But I mean, if you do read this book, Murder Machine, I suggest you look into it too. It might not sound sexy, doing chop cars and selling used car parts and stealing cars, but you would not believe the amount of money that's involved in these types of operations. And I mean, I think Nino is probably the best boss that Roy would have, because Nino's the type of guy he's just going to turn a blind eye to most of the stuff that Roy was up to, minus maybe one thing that we'll get into in a little bit. But even then, Nino just kind of yelled at Roy a bit, and then just kind of let Roy do his own thing again.
I think all Nino was concerned with was money. Whatever was
Yeah.
happening, he just wanted the money, and he was a really bottom line kind of guy. He didn't want a lot of stuff getting in the way of the bottom line.
Yeah.
Loan sharking is a really interesting part of the mafia, because it really is the nitty gritty. And like you said, it's the not very sexy part of the mafia, but that's where they made a ton of money, was loaning money out at these exorbitant rates where people would have to pay huge interest balloon payments, we might call them now, called VIGs, once a week of the huge percentages of the base amount that the people would take out, and they would really have to take out another loan shark loan to be able to just pay the interest on these loans. And it was kind of a, once you got into that system of taking out a loan shark loan, you were never going to get out of it.
Yeah, and people like Roy would use it too, where okay, like okay, whatever, you're never gonna be able to pay your loan again. Okay, so I'm part of your business now, 50%. Or in the case of the Gemini Lounge, the guy who had actually owned the bar at the time had a loan out for Roy, and he was never going to be able to pay it off. So Roy said he saw an opportunity. It's like, oh, this is where I can do my business. It's got an apartment in the back, and it's a nice place. I like it. Okay, whatever. Give me your bar. Just send your bar off to me, and that's it. We'll call it even. And that a lot of the times, this is how these mob guys would build up these little business empires. These people would take loans out % of the business for 50% or just the entire thing.
Let's talk about Andre Katz. That was one of the first big murders that Roy Demeo was involved with. And it was one of the first ones that really got a lot of police attention put on him.
Yeah, so Andre Katz was involved in the chop shop business with Roy, and it's not exactly sure what happened, or he ends up getting busted, but and Chris Rosenberg was there too, and people say it was like related to the drugs that Chris Rosenberg was selling at the time, but Andre Katz just kind of comes to the conclusion. He's like, well, I'm not going to jail for these guys, and volunteers to go talk to the authorities about the chop shop and the drug business that was going on in his facilities. Roy finds out that he was doing this because Roy had paid police officers off in the stolen vehicles department of the NYPD. I'm not exactly sure what the department's called, but this is what they specialize in stolen vehicles, and said that Katz is talking. And Roy comes up with this plan. Well, he knows too much, so we got to get rid of him. So they hire this young lady to lure Katz into, I believe it was like a hotel or something, and Roy and his crew kidnap him, and then they end up killing him at this supermarket, and dispose of the body. And this is where the Gemini method kind of slowly starts, where they chop the body up and they start depositing parts in various dumps around the city. But they don't do it quite well this time, because apparently some pedestrians saw like a leg um sticking out of a trash can or something, and then they end up learning that they have to become more efficient, cleaner at this.
And this is we're going to be getting into some things that are definitely not family friendly, so to speak, and we're not going to be graphic with it at all, but this is very brutal stuff, and I would definitely suggest that maybe for the next couple of minutes you screen this for content if you're listening in the minivan. But the Gemini method, the Gemini was the name of the club that Roy had taken over through his loan sharking. And so this crew of really psychotic killers that Roy gathers together in the very broad strokes, and we don't really need to get into all the nitty gritty. People can read Murder Machine, and there's plenty of other information out there on the specifics on how they killed people at the Gemini. But in general, what were they doing at the Gemini?
Yeah, so they used it was called the Gemini Method because it took place in the Gemini Lounge, and they would lure people into the back apartment, which was you can look up pictures, you can see the Gemini Lounge, you can see this where the apartment building was. They would lure people back there, and basically, without getting into like a ton of the details, because it's rough stuff. They came up with pretty much the most efficient way and cleanest way of getting rid of somebody who was trouble and disposing of the body. So there was really no way to, if there was no body, there was no crime. At the end of the day, the cops could be like, well, we saw him go into the Gemini Lounge. Roy could be, well, he left a couple hours later, and then the cops are just if they can't find a body, they have nothing to pursue. And this was highly effective. There's different reports about, did Roy and his crew kill up to 200 people, 100 people? I didn't think it was probably around 100. I think it was 47 or 49 they can officially confirm were done by the Demeo crew. But, to kind of put this in perspective, nobody really had taken industrial murder. Nobody had done this since pretty much, Murder Incorporated.
Yeah, they would really dispose of the bodies. They had a garbage dump, and nobody's going those garbage dumps like in New York City, they're getting feet of garbage piled every single day in there. So, I mean, if you don't know about something, if you want to look for something that happened a week ago, you could be digging through hundreds of feet of garbage. It's just never going to happen. No police department in the world has the tools to do that.
Yeah, and they were at one point they did think about like start digging through this garbage later on when they were trying to find some of these bodies so they could pin more, crimes on Roy. And they looked at it and they said like this is just not possible. There's no way to do it. I mean, and if when you look into how they came up with the Gemini method and then the disposal of the bodies, it's ghoulish. But I mean, it is brilliant. It worked for the amount of murders that these guys were doing, and Roy was personally did a lot of these murders himself. I mean, so if we're looking at like 100 people, let's just say it's 100 people. I mean, how many did the Green River killer kill?
Nowhere near that, I don't think.
I mean, you could say that like Roy was one of the worst, if not the worst, like serial killers in American history, depending on how you look at it. I wouldn't say Roy was a serial killer just because I don't really want to, compare and contrast. But I mean, in terms of just the body count, yeah, it's like 100 people. That's and Ted Bundy wasn't anywhere near that.
It's also, I think that this is a good place to really mark that Roy the businessman is a mafia guy. Within this time period, if I'm not mistaken, he does get his button, or becomes a made member of the mafia, kind of against. Not everybody wanted him to become a made man.
No, well, so Gambino dies and Paul Castellano becomes the head of the family, and so the books open up and Roy is bugging Nino, get me my button, get me my button. I've earned it. I mean, and for the family, he was taking murder contracts and he was doing all the dirty work that nobody else really, well, it's not that nobody else really wanted to do. It's just nobody else was doing it as good as Roy was. And Paul kind of looked down at these street guys. He didn't really like being associated with them. And that's not fair from Paul to be saying that because he would take their money anyways. But the one thing that Paul was like, Roy, he's uncontrollable. This guy's a loose cannon, and I can't really trust him. So Paul didn't really want to make him a made man, and so Roy comes to the conclusion, well, I just got to make even more money, and then they can't possibly deny me. And he opens up an alliance with the Westies, who are a pretty infamous gang of I believe it's the Hell's Kitchen area of New York. They're like the Irish mob. And by opening up this alliance with the Westies, he's able to he opens up like construction contracts, which is what Paul was really into. He was more into like the labor union type stuff, the more white collar crimes. And the Westies end up becoming kind of like an arm of the Gambino family because of Roy Demeo and Nino Gaggi setting up a meeting between, I can't remember the head of the Westies at the time, him and Paul Castellano. And later on, Roy ends up becoming the go-between between the Gambino family and the Westies in terms of just all business deals. And this is like a pretty huge deal because the Westies are infamous game because of their brutality, but they also controlled they had a lot of power in New York at the time. And this is basically because Roy's able to pull this off. Paul really can't deny making him a made guy anymore, and he gets his made status.
Let's talk a little bit about Paul Castellano, because Paul Castellano, he came up in our last episode about the Iceman. To me, he seemed like really the most unlikeliest of mafia guys, because he had a huge legitimate business in meat packing. His business was in selling meat and chicken, and he made tons and tons of money. If I'm not mistaken, both of his sons were involved in the business and they were completely legit. And I don't understand why someone like Paul Castellano would want to be involved in this really dirty, nasty underworld element of the mafia, when he could have just been involved completely in the white collar part of the mafia, which in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, sure, if you were in labor unions or if you were in something like meat packing, yeah, you were connected to the mafia, but you didn't have to be in the nitty gritty of being around people like Roy DeMeo and the Westies and the really gritty, nasty part of the mafia and the organized crime.
No, I think it's because he just kind of grew up with it and kind of got pulled into it, and because he was such a good earner. I mean, it would make kind of sense that you would want that guy to be the head of the family because nobody knew how to like make as much money as Paul and do it somewhat. I mean, do it legitimately for the most part and not attract like police attention. But I don't like Paul wasn't really cut out for the job too. Like I don't think he really understood like stuff that was coming down the pipe in terms of like weak Rico and like wiretapping because he would have all the guys like show up at the I believe it was like the Veterans Club that they
Yeah.
called every 2 weeks, every week to sit down and talk about, what was going on in the Gambino family. And it's the cops are just kind of sitting there laughing at them. And it's like, well, I mean, really? They're all going to show up at the same time? We're just going to stand out here, pictures, and and his own house was wiretapped at one point. He just doesn't seem. It seemed like probably like a good idea in theory. This guy's a great earner, and he seems to keep his nose pretty clean. Like, who better to run the family? But in practice, it didn't really work out all that well. And I mean, he was so like white collar too that he really kind of pissed off the guys that were like the street guys. And if you're going to be the head of a mafia family, you have to be able to strike a balance between the two, where the street guys are happy because you do need them. At the end of the day, the mafia is kind of built on muscle. If you don't have that, the threat of violence, if the rest of it doesn't really work all that well. I mean, especially in like labor unions and like the construction business, and even Paul's chicken and poultry business was built on kind of loan sharking, where he was successful at it, and then he would lend out loans to like other butcher shops and what have you, and then they obviously wouldn't be able to pay, and then he would just take like 25 or 50% of their business, and that's kind of how it grew. That doesn't work if you don't really have the guys like Roy DeMeo showing up at, Joe Schmo's butcher house saying, this is how it's going to go down. And if it doesn't go down in the next couple of days like this, we're going to take care of business. If they're not afraid that these guys are going to take care of business, the whole thing doesn't really work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that definitely. And somebody like Paul, he was perfect as the boss in that he had this really good knowledge of the white collar part. But at that point in the Gambino family, the Gambino family was really the mafia in New York City. There was still the five families. And if we go a little bit further, the DeCavalcantes in New Jersey, right next door. But it was really the Gambinos were the game. They were the biggest family, and they were divided between the Manhattan faction under Neil Della Croce and Nino Gaggi in the Brooklyn faction. It was a family that was really split between these two regional factions, plus the white collar faction and the more blue collar faction. So it was a very tough, or it was a huge umbrella, you might say, and it was maybe too big for its own good.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different theories about like if Neil Delacroix had been made boss instead of Paul Castellano, like how history would have been different. Like just John Gotti come around, and like it's interesting, but yeah, like Paul just wasn't the guy for the job, in my opinion. I mean, you can't look down on the street guys because without them, the rest of it just doesn't work. And like the intimidation of somebody like Roy Demeo is like essential to the mafia. If that doesn't, you got to treat those guys fairly because they're just as important as the guys, doing, running the concrete business, which is pretty much the mob ran the entire concrete business. It's crazy to think that in New York, if you poured any concrete, that was the mob's concrete. You're paying the mob one way or another.
Now, the other thing, so we have this really that Paul Castellano is like one of those people with the plates trying to like spin them on sticks and keep this whole thing of the Gambino
Yeah.
crime family going. Then you have, if we zoom in on on Roy DeMeo, looking at his personal life, he was somebody who, for the most part, lived two separate lives. That he didn't live in Brooklyn, he lived in the suburbs. He lived a completely normal suburban lifestyle at the same time of being a brutal street criminal in New York City.
And his son actually wrote a book about his experience, with his father. And I think initially when he wrote the book, he wanted to prove that his dad wasn't as bad as everyone was saying he was, and that kind of walked away